At first, Mr. Krien seemed to be an ordinary math teacher, but it turns out that his past is not typical at all. As a distinguished veteran of the Vietnam War, experiencing combat and all its effects close up, as well as previously being a prominent engineering student, he is one of Verdugo Hills High School's most interesting people.
Well, I was in the Army for a little bit, and spent some time in Vietnam, which wasn't one of my favorite stints in life. I was a grunt, and they made me, wherever the action was, that's where I got sent. And if there wasn't action, we usually created it. They just put it in helicopters and sent us over there. And whatever was going on was going on. You know, so it was usually a combat of one kind or another. I mean, I got drafted. Okay, you need to learn a little more about your history. Have your history teachers explain some of this to you about the draft and that sort of thing. Those days, I mean, the world was an entirely different place than it is today. It was basically, particularly starting in the 50s, and it escalated in the 60s. It was really a two-country world, the United States and the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And that was called Russia in those days. And that was all the communist countries that were lumped together in one. So anyway, you had the two countries basically running the world, the United States on one side, the Russians on the other side. And all the other countries were either pro-Russia, pro-US, or neutral, or tried to be neutral. I would say there were more countries that were pro-US, but at the same time, the Russians took over a lot of countries. They took over Czechoslovakia, they took over Hungary, they took over Turkey, Poland, all kinds of countries where they just went in and took them over. And it came at the end of the Second World War, and people didn't want to get back involved and go in and try to save those countries from the Russians, simply because they didn't want to get involved in that kind of a world war again. And other things came along the way. I mean, you ended up with Korea and then Vietnam, and other kind of things have occurred along the line, and then things that are going on currently. But in those days, it was a two-country thing. And it kind of came to a head with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Russians trying to get missiles and so forth put into Cuba, which would be aimed at the United States because Cuba's only like 90 miles away. And we ended up firing around across the bow of the Russian ship. Everybody thought the war was going to start. That was under Kennedy's regime. And that's probably not the right word, but when he was president. But in those days, I mean, he was very special. I don't really know how to really describe him, but he was really super loved by the American people. The assassination was a terrible thing, very definitely the most terrible thing that's happened in my lifetime. Had to do with the spread of communism. And in those days, China and Russia were super big allies. They had their fall apart at a later date because they were both communism, but two different communisms trying to jive, and it didn't work out. And you know, I'm not sure how to describe a lot of things because there were a lot of things going on that I didn't fully understand myself. What I did understand, though, was that like Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia, anything that I saw while I was over there were very, very backwards countries, extremely backwards countries. Highway 1, which was the main highway in Vietnam, was no more than a dirt road that north and south throughout the entire country. Combating communism was the right thing to do. I still believe that. I don't know that fighting the way it was fought was the way to go about it, because they tried to fight it as a policing action, and you know, and I don't think it really worked out. Obviously not. That's why we ended up leaving, and you know, it never got put together properly. There was never a wall. There was never a front. You couldn't just say, okay, we've got this ground and now it's ours, and then keep marching through the country. It didn't work that way. They kept going from place to place to place to place. And I was in one of those situations. I was with the 1st Air Cav, and they used to put us into helicopters and take us off to wherever the action was, and if it wasn't there, they would give us some reason to create it, make it happen. So I was constantly in one battle after another. Some were really big, some were a lot smaller, some were just kind of mild altercations, but it was just constant shooting and gang and bombs and you name it kind of a thing. That's what I did day in, day out. Oh, probably trying to get into Khe Sanh to liberate the Marines who were completely surrounded. That would have to be the one. I remember going in there that my entire company became a squad in another company. And I laid in the same place for 3 days. That's got to be by far the most vivid of all my memories. I didn't have a great deal of difficulty. I do remember one incident, though, when I first came back, initially. In the first week I was back, I was standing on a street corner, not actually a street corner, but in front of an open shop in Des Plaines, Illinois, with my mother. And there was a car that was coming by, and it had a sound exactly like an incoming missile that we used to hear, where you could hear this whoosh, and you knew it was coming in and it was going to land somewhere near you. And I remember tackling my mother on the street and jumping on top of her and yelling, "Get down," to everybody that was in the vicinity, and they all looked at me like I was crazy. Which I guess would make sense, tackling my mother on the street, But you had to understand that my mind hadn't gotten back to civilian life and the way things were in the country. So that was just kind of an embarrassing moment, I guess. But